Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
To see that the man had committed his crime before of murder, been locked away for it, and then somebody's let him out.
Well, you don't, do you? You don't expect anybody to come along and poison you when you're working with them.
The man was so dangerous, he needed to be locked away from the rest of the human race.
In 1971, the quiet Hertfordshire village of Bovingdon, in the southwest of England, was home to a specialist lens manufacturer. John Hadland Laboratories produced infrared lens used in military equipment, and it was here where Diana Smart fell ill.
I worked there for 29 years. It was very interesting and not bragging, but I must have been good at it. So I used to help out whenever they were short, and I was short of work and other people were off sick or something. I'd help out in the office or the stores or anywhere that was relevant.
Diana was one of many employees to take ill in the summer of 1971. The sickness that swept through the factory was thought to be a virus and became known as the Bovingdon bug.
I felt awful and I had diarrhoea, and I used to wear trousers with elastic bottoms and they was full of toilet. It was dreadful and I had pains in the same time.
It got to a point where over 70 members of staff were ill at one time or another within the factory, and again, the medical authorities could not work out why this was happening.
I became sick twice and they couldn't understand why, because they took me home and I had diarrhoea and sickness, but about 2 days later I'd be back at work again.
She was very, very ill many, many times. So we basically grew up thinking that she was ill more often than not, if you know what I mean.
Several staff members were even hospitalised with the mystery illness.
It gradually became clear that it wasn't a bug that was going round at the firm. It was clear that people were being poisoned, and Graham Young practically put his hands up and said, "It's me."
24-year-old Graham Young had recently started as a storeman at the factory.
I remember distinctly because my birthday is in May. I've got a picture of him in the kitchen and you can see he looks a weird fellow. There was something peculiar about him which I couldn't get to the bottom of, and that's when I went into the office and I did complain because he wasn't doing anything. He was leaving all the work to me.
Graham Young had a fairly menial job. One of his duties was taking refreshments, tea boy as it was called in those days, taking refreshments round to workers. So he had a good opportunity of adding to the drinks the doses of thallium.
And he watches with intense interest the effect that this thallium-laced tea is having on the workers.
Gradually, those co-workers became more and more ill. They developed the symptoms of thallium poisoning, which is a little bit like arsenic poisoning, gradually becoming weaker, loss of hair, loss of feeling in the legs.
Thallium is a heavy metal commonly used in the manufacture of electronics. Compounds containing the chemical are colourless, odourless, tasteless, and highly toxic. Just 1 gram can be fatal, and it's considered one of the most toxic elements on the periodic table. Thallium poisoning causes nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea in the first 48 hours. Within a few days, the nervous system comes under assault, resulting in pain, convulsions, numbness, psychosis, and even coma.
There was one time I said to him, "Oh, that tea tastes horrible. It's got metallic-y taste." So he said, "Oh, perhaps it's a bit strong for you. Just drink it." So, of course, I drank it and it left a funny taste in my mouth. A little while afterwards was the first time that I rushed to the toilet. Of course, I went back to the stores and didn't say anything to anybody. And then a few days later, it happened again. I don't know whether I collapsed or I half collapsed, but he took me out into the garden and sat me in a chair under a tree. I was having trouble to breathe. And I sat out there until one of the office staff saw me, one of the managers, Jeff Foster, and he said, "Di, we'll take you home, you're not well." And that's when I stayed at home then, until they discovered him.
2 of Young's co-workers had died since he started working at the factory. The first was his supervisor, Bob Eagle.
He was very nice. He was about to retire. He was a counsellor as well, but he kept being ill on and off and took time off of work and nobody took any notice of it. And then he died. A few of us went to his funeral.
4 months later, in November, a second colleague of Diana's died after weeks of rapidly ailing health.
Fred Biggs, he lived at Chipperfield and he was another elderly man, about to retire. And he became sick, same sort of thing. And because it was in a short distance of one another, they investigated, the firm did, because it was sort of a mystery illness for 2 people to go like that.
The 2 deaths caused widespread anxiety at Hadland's, so the firm arranged for a physician to come out and speak to the staff.
Now, whilst this whole medical examination is going on, Graham Young made a fatal mistake.
Graham Young, in fact, asked a question of this doctor. Did not the symptoms of this bug look to you as though it might be thallium poisoning? Just out of the blue. So it was almost as if he could not resist demonstrating his knowledge.
And he said to the doctor, he said, "Have you ever considered thallium poisoning?" Now, the doctor thought, what a strange comment to come from someone like that. He thought it was so strange that he told the company. The company thought it was so strange, they told the local police.
Police launched a confidential investigation, beginning with the examination of the 2 workers who had died. Both bodies were found to contain lethal doses of thallium.
Bob Eagle's ashes were analysed, and it was found that traces of thallium could be traced in the ashes, and this was the first time that a case was confirmed from a body that had been cremated.
Almost overnight, the local police realised this is what's happening. It's poisoning everyone. They moved very quickly, and in fact arrested Graham the next day.
Police come at 12 o'clock midnight. I think it was about 2 days later. And they questioned me till very late at night, taking hair samples, blood samples. They took swabs from my nose. I went through all the tests that they normally do for investigations, apparently. And then they come back the next day and said that I'd been poisoned by Graham Young from the stores.
They came round, but we was never involved in any of the questioning or anything like that. Once they came round, we disappeared. I suppose I was probably about 14. My brother's a couple of years younger, so he'd be 12. To be fair, we was kept pretty much in the dark. We didn't really understand what was going on at that sort of age. But we could see that there was something wrong, you know.
The two children were put upstairs so that they weren't hearing what was going on. And we bought them a television and they watched television, and that's how they found out that it was Graham Young.
On the 21st of November 1971, police swooped on his aunt's house on Alma Road in Sheerness, Kent. Young had thallium on him when he was arrested. Police also found thallium and other poisons at his home in Maynard Road in Hemel Hempstead, along with something somehow even more sinister.
When they searched his home address, they made a discovery of a diary, and they found this incredibly detailed diary that Graham had kept, proving that he was the one placing these doses of thallium in the tea. It's quite unbelievable. I've actually seen this diary, and it's incredibly detailed. It gives the day, the time, the dosage, the number of people that had it administered, and the symptoms of what people were actually suffering from. It's like reading a medical record. Quite extraordinary.
Yes, Graham Young knew the effect that the poisons would have on people. For example, thallium, he knew the effects. And it gave him intense pleasure to try and get the doses just right so he could see an incremental decline in the health of the people that he was poisoning. And his diary was quite detailed about the symptoms. He was obviously watching every day very closely the movements, the behaviour, and the symptoms of the co-workers that he was killing.
Police would make another surprising discovery while investigating the Hadland poisonings.
The local police did a background check on Graham, and as you can imagine, nearly fell off their chairs when they realised the man that they were dealing with. They were dealing with someone who for 8 years had been treated in Broadmoor Hospital for poisoning his own family.
9 years earlier, in 1962, 15-year-old Graham Young had been sentenced to Broadmoor Hospital, a maximum security psychiatric facility for patients who have committed serious offences.
Now, he was the youngest person to go to Broadmoor since 1885, which shows how rare his situation was and really how complex he was as a human being.
It's usually an adult because they need knowledge of the poison, how to administer it, so that the victim is not suspicious. So it is very unusual that Graham Young was 14 years old when he was discovered to be poisoning members of his family. I don't know of any other cases younger than that. There are cases where the perpetrator was a little older, but he was very young to really start poisoning members of his family.
Graham Young was born in 1947. His mother died not long after his birth, and his father, unable to cope with a 3-month-old baby and an 8-year-old daughter on his own, sent Graham to live with an aunt close by for several years until he remarried.
Now, from a very early age, Graham was different. He was quite an introverted child. He used to like his own company. He didn't like socialising with other children. When he was about 10, his father gave him a beginner's chemistry set, and this set Graham off on his path through life.
Growing up in post-war London, Young had a strange obsession with Hitler, which alienated him from his schoolmates, who were also put off by his interest in the occult. There were rumours he even performed rituals involving animal sacrifice, and later, neighbours said several cats had disappeared around that time. Anyone within his vicinity risked becoming a target for his sadistic experiments. Young's immediate family all became ill, at one point or another.
Graham started to use the poisons he was manufacturing in his bedroom against his own family. He would start lacing little bits of poison and different chemicals into the family food and watching his own family fall ill.
His sister Winifred collapsed, disembarking the train on her way to work. Doctors later discovered that she had consumed extracts of belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade. Earlier that morning, she had sipped from a cup of tea Graham had made for her. She complained about its taste and poured the rest of the cup down the sink. Yet it was enough to bring her to her knees. But it was his stepmother, Molly, who bore the brunt of his gruesome experiments.
He resented his stepmother, Molly. She'd taken the place of his natural mother, so she was on the receiving end of the first parts of his experimentation into administering poisons to people.
Easter Sunday 1962 was on the 21st of April, and Graham's father, Fred, came home from lunch to find his son watching from the kitchen window as Molly writhed in agony on the back lawn. She died later that evening. Fred was hospitalized not long after his wife's funeral. Suffering from stomach cramps, vomiting and diarrhea, he was diagnosed with antimony poisoning. A highly toxic heavy metal, antimony is used to harden lead and in the manufacture of batteries.
At that time, things started to unravel for Graham because Graham's aunt was suspicious, knowing his obsession really by this stage with poisons. The whole family had been ill the year before and it was unexplainable. And particularly where school friends had been involved, it couldn't have been sort of a family bug. So then at the same time, it emerged that the science teacher at Graham's grammar school had looked into Graham's desk and found bottles of poison and books on poisoners and reported this to the headmaster. The headmaster, understandably, had contacted a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist contacted the police, and not long after that, Graham Young was arrested.
Aged just 14 at the time of his arrest, Young was committed to Broadmoor, the high-security hospital for the criminally insane. While there, Young took an interest in botany. When another inmate died from cyanide poisoning, Young was never charged. Despite pointing out the presence of cyanide in the cherry laurel bushes that grew on the grounds. 9 years later, when Young was 23 years old, senior psychiatrists made the surprising decision to release him back into the community.
He was released from Broadmoor because the people who had to make the decision to release him took the view that he was very young when he was admitted, and it was judged that he wasn't a threat to society anymore.
This horrified the ordinary nurses in Broadmoor. And I know this because a colleague of mine, his wife used to work in Broadmoor, and she used to look after Graham when he was growing up there. And she said, this boy is so dangerous that the nursing staff thought he will never set foot out of this institution because he was too dangerous to be let loose in the public.
In February 1971, Young was released from Broadmoor Hospital and placed into a halfway house in Slough. He found work at John Hadland Laboratories not long after his release. And while Hadlands knew that Young had been a patient at Broadmoor, they had not been told why he was there.
It was annoying to see that a man had done this thing before, been released by people thinking that he's okay, to commit exactly the same crime again find hard to believe. And then later on in life, glorify him by putting him in Madame Tussauds as a waxwork. I have photographs of my children standing next to him, and it's a life-size replica of him. No, it's just not right.
Young's trial for 2 counts of murder and 4 counts of administering poison began on the 19th of June, 1972. He pleaded not guilty.
Went on for 2 weeks. I was questioned in the box for about 3 days. And when he was in court, he was only to the left of me, a few paces away, and I could see he was watching me all the time. I felt awful. It was horrible. I was frightened to death. The police come and fetched me every day and brought me home.
Graham Young showed very little remorse when he was questioned by police and at the trial. And this ties in, I think, with his interest in inanimate things like poisons and chemicals, and his lack of understanding and lack of fellow feeling about the pain that it was causing to his victims.
It's as clear as a bell to me, something that I will not forget.
The press dubbed him the teacup poisoner.
The press come to see me. It was horrendous. They come from far and wide and they pestered me a lot.
Young was sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment for the murders of Bob Eagle and Fred Biggs, and 5 years for the poisoning of Diana Smart.
Very bitter towards him because I've suffered quite a lot and nobody's realised. It's not a thing you talk about.
She's always ill now. She doesn't eat properly. Her medication sort of rules her life. It's just been very difficult, really. And I've, feeling for the mother. It's sad. She's an outgoing person. She gets up and goes around, but it's catching up with her now. It's not just old age. This has had a tremendous impact on her life.
Graham Young died in prison in 1990, not long before his 43rd birthday, having served just 18 years of his sentence.
Graham Young did seem to take a sadistic pleasure in the effects of the poisons that he was administering, and it did seem as though he did lack that ability to put himself in the place of anyone else. They were objects, almost like insects, that he was watching under a magnifying glass rather than other human beings.
He had no empathy with fellow human beings. I think it's the sheer coldness of Graham Young. You can hardly call him a human being. He's so cold. A lot of murderers I've dealt with, their families are very dear to them, but they will then go outside the family to kill people. But their families are still very important. But Graham Young, there wasn't a single human being on this planet that he didn't see as a potential victim.
People were kind to him and I helped him. And apparently it turns out that he did only do it to people that he was friendly with. Thank God he's been caught, bastard. They ought to hang him.
One evening in November 1984, 13-year-old Jonathan Bird was watching television at home in North Carolina. A news bulletin announced the first woman in over 2 decades to be executed for murdering her boyfriend.
Her name was Velma Barfield. And Barfield is my mother's maiden name. So I just thought, oh, wonder if she's related somehow. My brother's wife saw this newscast and also looked into it. And between us, we figured out that this woman, Velma Barfield, that was not her maiden name, that she got that name when she married my grandfather.
She's a cold-blooded killer, but she was primarily a thief seeking to cover her thievery by committing murder.
Thank you so much.
Jonathan was just a baby when his much-loved grandfather died in 1971, apparently from ongoing health issues. His grandfather, Jennings Barfield, was one of 6 people believed to have been poisoned by Velma.
I never really got to know them. There's a picture of me with my grandfather. His hands were enormous. His hands were like as big as I was as a baby. He was a big guy.
Born Margie Velma Bullard in October 1932, Velma grew up in rural South Carolina during the Great Depression. Her mother, Lily, was a homemaker. Her father, Murphy, was a struggling farmer and an authoritarian at home who often turned violent. The second of 9 children, living under Murphy's roof, was often tense.
Velma barely got through high school, not well educated, not really educated at all in anything that would lead her to gainful employment.
In 1949, at age 17, Velma eloped with high school beau Thomas Burke. They settled in the small town of Parkton, South Carolina, where Velma had spent time as a child. By September 1953, they had a 20-month-old son, Ronald, and a newborn daughter, Kim. Velma thrived on motherhood, while Thomas found work as a delivery driver. But 10 years later, a medical operation on Velma would be the beginning of an unstoppable descent.
She had a hysterectomy that was improperly completed or performed.
Velma experienced terrible back pain and depression.
It was something typical scene that you see these days where people are prescribed prescription painkillers. And of course, back then, you know, it was a different class of painkillers. Now it's primarily opiates. But, you know, it morphs one thing into the next. And before you know it, you got a whole class of addicts on your hand.
She was addicted to prescription drugs. She had 2, 3, 4 doctors who didn't know about each other. She would get extra doses of things. And she didn't want anyone to find out. She was very ashamed of that.
It wasn't uncommon for her children to find her passed out on the floor. Her husband, meanwhile, had descended into alcoholism. One night in 1969, he apparently dropped a lit cigarette while in a drunken stupor, setting fire to his mattress. He died of smoke inhalation. Now a widow, Velma needed employment. She found it at a department store where she met and became friends with Jonathan Bird's grandmother.
My grandmother, for a while, worked at a department store called Belk's. They worked at the Belk's department store together.
Jonathan's grandmother hired Velma to help her care for her husband, Jennings.
Velma was also kind of a nurse, a caretaker. So that's why she was helping my grandmother care for my grandfather. They were very religious, faithful, religious people. They had, I think, 6 children, and family was very important to them. Education, that their children got an education, was very important to them. My grandmother died in 1969. She had a brain aneurysm. It was a very sudden death, unexpected. Velma was a friend of the family who was helping. She would cook meals. She helped my grandmother care for my grandfather who had emphysema and diabetes. And about 6 months after my grandmother died, my grandfather married Velma.
Jennings and Velma married on August 23rd, 1970. To her delight, it was a church wedding, in contrast to her elopement with Thomas Burke. Within months of getting married, Velma overdosed twice on prescription drugs, alarming Jennings. Conscious of his concern, Velma sought to shut him up.
She had some trauma early in her life that she never dealt with, and she always said she wanted to make people sick. She didn't mean to murder people, she just wanted to make them sick to take everybody's attention away from her problems. That's what she described as her motivation.
Velma began poisoning her new husband. By early March 1971, Jennings Barfield was vomiting and suffering from diarrhea. He appeared to be succumbing to his pre-existing conditions. Barely 6 months after their wedding, Jennings Barfield died on March 22nd, 1971.
He had a lot of health problems, so it wasn't an unexpected death.
And neither was it deemed suspicious. Velma moved back in with her parents and resumed her drug abuse. She was hospitalized for 3 weeks after another overdose and lost her job at the department store. So Velma sought another means of money: theft. Forging her mother's signature, she took out loans, using their house as collateral. In December 1974, her mother, Lillian, quizzed her daughter about an overdue statement. In response, Velma bought a bottle of insecticide and poisoned her. That evening, her mother was overcome with excruciating cramping, vomiting, and diarrhea. As an ambulance transferred Lillian to a hospital in Fayetteville, Velma sat in the back with her.
Then Velma's mother died.
She killed her because she was reported about. She was stealing from the elderly people that she was hired to look after. She would steal from people and they'd figure out that it was Velma who had stolen from them. Velma would say, I'm not going to prison. They'll send me to prison. Let me just slip a little something in here.
That something was arsenic.
Well, number one, there's a lot of arsenic around here, or there used to be. Arsenic is endemic to rural activities, farming, food production of all kinds. You got to get rid of vermin, and arsenic, very effective at doing all that.
And you just pour a little bit in something, it's tasteless, odorless. That was her method of choice for all the murders.
Velma was becoming prolific.
She was always in need of money, as most drug addicts are, because drugs don't come cheap. They're always readily available, but they ain't free.
She was addicted to prescription drugs. She had 2, 3, 4 doctors who didn't know about each other. She would get extra doses of things, and she didn't want anyone to find out. She was very ashamed of that.
She was primarily a thief seeking to cover her thievery by committing murder.
Velma started working for 94-year-old Montgomery and his 84-year-old wife, Dolly Edwards.
I mean, she's essentially acting like an unlicensed certified nursing assistant, but she didn't even have a license for that.
By January, Montgomery had died, but Velma stayed on to help Dolly. On Saturday, February 26th, Dolly felt the onset of the flu coming on. On Sunday, Velma called an ambulance to take Dolly to the emergency room. Discharged that night, by Tuesday, Dolly was dead. In 1975, Velma was charged and convicted for check fraud. Sentenced for 6 months, she was released after serving 3.
And another couple she was taking care of, they died.
Their names were Record and John Henry Lee. In June 1977, John had died from a severe stomach virus.
And eventually there was a sort of a younger man, maybe in his 40s, Stuart Taylor, who was her boyfriend.
By 1977, Velma had been stepping out with tobacco farmer Stuart Taylor. But she had also been defrauding him, cashing checks on his account to fund her drug addiction. While the couple were in Lumberton, Velma picked up some ant taro from the chemist. Stuart had agreed to accompany Velma to an evangelical church congregation that evening. But before departure, Velma had placed some of the arsenic-based ant taro into his lunchtime tea and evening beer. That night, during the church service, Stuart was overcome with severe nausea. Vomiting profusely, exhausted from diarrhea, by February 3rd, 1978, Stuart became Velma's 6th victim. Velma had left another family heartbroken.
It wasn't until the final case where she killed her steady boyfriend and his family said, this doesn't make sense. Something's wrong here. You need to investigate. And through a long process, they end up, luckily they had a body to do an autopsy with.
Stuart's liver showed some abnormalities. When the chief medical officer learnt of Stuart's symptoms, he swiftly suspected arsenic was involved. His suspicion coincided with a tip-off to the Lumberton police chief.
Someone called the police anonymously and said, you need to look into this. A lot of people have died around Velma.
On March 10th, 1978, Velma was questioned by the police, at first about fraudulent checks. When they asked her about her relationship with recently deceased Stuart, she became agitated. The police let her go. They were biding their time. 3 days later, her son drove Velma back to the police station. Foregoing the offer of a lawyer, she confessed that she had only wanted to make Stuart sick.
That's what she described as her motivation. I believe that she believed that. She made herself believe that. So they exhumed bodies, they did testing. You can test people's hair for things after they're dead. And they prosecuted her maybe on only 1 or 2 of those murders, but there were 5 or 6 people, beginning with my grandfather.
Velma Barfield was charged with first-degree murder. Representing Robeson County was Joe Freeman Britt, also known as the world's deadliest district attorney, having dispatched a record number of defendants with the death penalty. Velma's attorney, in contrast, was conducting his first ever death penalty case. In December 1978, Velma was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Stuart Taylor and sentenced to death.
I don't think that Velma Barfield should be executed because she's poor and because she's uneducated and because she didn't have any resources to hire a great lawyer.
Velma chose to die from a lethal injection. At 2 a.m. on November 2nd, 1984, she received her own fatal dose. Wired up to an intravenous tube, she received a muscle relaxant called pancuronium bromide that caused her heart to stop painlessly, in contrast to her victims.
She was the last woman to be executed in the state of North Carolina. I have a vague memory of seeing the newscast and asking questions, trying to find an answer. I have a vague memory of asking my mother why she never told us. Nobody in the family ever talked about it. That was the way they dealt with it. I think by the time that I learned about the murder and that she was a serial killer and those kinds of things, it felt like it's something that happens, and it just happens to have happened in my family. And the bigger education was how my family dealt with it, that they actually just shut it down, they never talked about it. And I feel like there's some trauma that hasn't been dealt with in the family in that way. And that was an education. Like, I don't want to do that. I would rather talk about it.
Jennings Barfield's grandson has tried to make sense of the events that prematurely stole his grandfather away by writing a ballad about it.
People are in here dancing while I'm singing this song about a woman who killed my grandfather. Lemons and lemonade, I guess.
Then you killed Stuart Taylor. Someone had to know.
Members of my family were very upset about the song, so I wouldn't play it if they were around. Just brought up all those feelings. The feelings of betrayal, the feeling of not being safe in your own home, not being able to trust people. And I think just brought all those things up. Also, they felt like, why does she get all the fame? Why do people get to know about her and they don't know about your grandfather, who was a great person?
Falling